Before you press anything, I want you to understand what you just opened. 6 children, 6 closed files, 6 handwritings that in the course of more than 30 years of archival work, I have never been able to read without stopping. My name is Blackwell, and this is the part of the series the network lawyers did not want us to make. Part 1 of this investigation is already on the channel, and it crossed a number of views that the algorithm itself flagged as unusual for this category of content. That was the reason Part 2 was delayed. That was the reason the documents you are about to hear described had to be requested a second time from 3 different national archives. And that is the reason we are starting today with the sentence a judge in Newcastle in December of 1968 read out loud in a closed courtroom, and then, according to 2 clerks who were present, asked that it be struck from the official record. The sentence was written on the last page of a school notebook. It was written by an 11-year-old girl. It said, in a child's careful handwriting, with the letter R reversed the way children reverse it when they are still learning to write, "I was born to be a murderer." That is where we begin. 6 children, 6 moments when the comfortable adult phrase, "too young to know better," stopped working. Because all 6 of them knew. Every single one of them, at the time, understood exactly what they were doing. And that is what the files prove. Not rumor, not journalism, the files themselves. You do not need to see anything. I am going to read them to you. Mary Flora Bell was born on the 26th of May, 1957, in Newcastle upon Tyne. Her mother was a 17-year-old named Betty McCricket Bell, who reportedly screamed the first time the midwife placed the baby in her arms, "Take that thing away from me." That sentence appears in 3 separate witness statements given to the Northumbria police in the summer of 1968. 14 years after it was spoken, 3 different people remembered it. 3 different people wrote it down. Betty Bell was, by all accounts, confirmed in the case file that a researcher named Gitta Serini would later spend 4 years examining, a woman who worked as what the court documents of that era called a professional in specialist services, traveling frequently between Newcastle and Glasgow. She left Mary with relatives for long stretches. She returned erratically. And according to 4 separate interviews conducted by social workers between 1961 and 1967, she attempted on at least 4 occasions to end her daughter's life before the girl reached the age of 5. Pills in suites, an open window on a high floor, a staged fall down a staircase. The file uses the phrase "suspicious incident," and the phrase appears 4 times. None of these incidents resulted in charges. Mary Bell survived all 4. Mary Bell grew up in a house at White House Road in the Scotswood district of Newcastle, a working-class area of terraced homes, gas meters that ate shillings, coal fires that left soot on the windows. Her father, Billy Bell, was in and out of prison for armed robbery. Her stepfamily changed size every few months. By age 7, she was described by her primary school teacher, a Miss Long, as intelligent, verbal, and cold. By age 10, she was described in a note from the same teacher as "a child I am unable to read." The note was discovered in the school records in 1969, after everything had happened, and it was photocopied and added to the trial bundle. On the 25th of May, 1968, the day before her 11th birthday, a 4-year-old boy named Martin George Brown was found dead in an abandoned house on 1 street. Margaret's Road in Scotswood. There was no obvious cause, no bruising that indicated an adult assailant. 2 workmen had found him on the upper floor. The police initially considered the possibility of an accident, possibly a consumed pill from a bottle found nearby. The file remained open. 4 days later, on the 29th of May, a nursery school called the Woodlands Crescent Nursery, only a few streets away, was broken into overnight. There was no theft, but someone had left 4 notes. The notes were written in pencil, in 2 different children's handwritings. One said, "We did murder Martin Brown, you bass," and the sentence was incomplete. Another said, "Fuck off, we murder, watch out." A third said, "We murder, that means you are next." The police initially dismissed the notes as a prank. The word prank appears in the margin of the case file, circled later in red pen by a detective who, a few weeks after, would have reason to regret the circle. That detective was Inspector James Way, tracks in a row of derelict garages, locally known to children as the Tin Lizzie. He had been strangled. Police examined the area and found small marks that appeared to have been made by a pair of scissors. A capital letter M had been pressed lightly into the skin. 2 days later, during house-to-house inquiries, Inspector Dobson's team interviewed 2 girls who had been seen with Brian shortly before he disappeared. One was 13. Her name was Norma Joyce Bell, no relation to Mary despite the shared surname. The other was Mary Flora Bell, now 11 years and 2 months old. In the first interview, Mary said she had seen a boy hit Brian with a broken bit of a bus. In the second interview, 3 days later, she said that her friend Norma had done something to Brian. In the third interview, Norma said that Mary had done it. Over the course of 7 interviews, conducted according to the rules of that time, no tape recorder, handwritten notes, one parent present on some occasions and not others, the 2 girls produced 23 contradicting statements. But Mary Bell, in the 6th of those interviews, said something that changed the case. She said, "Brian had no worries now. He is safer in heaven." And then she said, "Murder is not that bad. We all die sometime anyway." That sentence, in the handwritten note of a policewoman named Sergeant Patricia Shields, is followed by 3 question marks and the remark, "Child smiling while speaking." The trial opened on the 5th of December, 1968, at Newcastle Assizes. The courtroom was partially closed to the public. Mary Bell wore a pink dress. Her mother did not attend the first day. The prosecution presented the 2 deaths as linked. The nursery notes were introduced as evidence. A school notebook belonging to Mary was produced, the one you already know about. Not only the final sentence, earlier in the notebook there were stories, short stories written as schoolwork. One described a boy falling from a high place. Another described a father being found dead in a chair. And on the last page, written later than the others in a different pen, was the sentence we have already discussed. The judge, Mr. Justice Cusack, was shown it. He read it silently. He then, according to 2 clerks, asked that the notebook be added to the case bundle, but that the specific sentence not be read aloud. The sentence was read aloud anyway, on the 4th day of the trial by the prosecution. It was the quietest moment in the courtroom of the entire proceedings, according to a Newcastle Chronicle reporter named Douglas Cowieson who covered it. He wrote in his notebook, "Silence like I have never heard in a courtroom. I could hear the ticking of Mr. Justice Cusack's pocket watch." The jury returned a verdict of manslaughter on grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma Bell was acquitted. Mary Bell was sentenced to detention at Her Majesty's pleasure, the British term for an indefinite sentence served in a secure institution for young offenders. A psychiatric examination, conducted by a Dr. David Westbury, concluded that Mary showed, in his exact words, classical symptoms of psychopathy combined with an IQ well above average. She was 11 years and 7 months old. She would spend the next 12 years in 3 different institutions, including the Red Bank Secure Unit, and later, as an adult, a women's prison. In 1977, she briefly escaped from a unit at Moore Court and was photographed in the company of a boy in Blackpool before being recaptured 3 days later. She was released in 1980, aged 23, under a new name. In 1984, she had a daughter. In 2003, her adult daughter was granted anonymity for life by a British court, an order known as a Mary Bell Order, still used today. In 2009, Mary became a grandmother. She is, at the time of this recording, still alive. Her identity is protected by one of the most unusual injunctions in British legal history. The little girl who wrote, "I was born to be a murderer," became the most legally protected person ever convicted of killing a child in the United Kingdom. That is the ending the file has. There is no other. John Venables was born on the 13th of August, 1982. Robert Thompson was born 9 days later, on the 23rd of August, 1982. Both boys grew up in Liverpool. Both boys were 10 years old in February of 1993. They were not friends since birth. They became friends in the 4th year of primary school at St. Mary's CE Primary after a teacher moved Thompson down a year for behavioral reasons and placed him in the same class as Venables. The school file, later examined during the trial at Preston Crown Court, described Thompson as coming from a household where domestic violence was reported by neighbors in 1985, 1987, 1989, and 1992. Thompson's father left the family when Thompson was 6. Thompson's mother, Anne, reportedly drank heavily and had 7 children in the house, 3 of whom were under social services review. Robert Thompson himself had been, according to a school report from 1991, the victim of bullying by his older brothers, one of whom had set fire to his bedroom door in 1990. That brother was later, separately, placed in care. John Venables came from a different kind of household. His parents, Neil and Susan Venables, were separated but still in contact. His mother suffered from clinical depression. His father worked irregular hours. John had learning difficulties and had been placed on the Special Educational Needs Register. His behavior at school included, in 1992, incidents of self-harm in front of other children, banging his head against desks, screaming in class, and on one documented occasion, pressing a ruler against his own throat until it left a mark. Both boys, in short, had files. On the 11th of February, 1993, a Thursday, Venables and Thompson skipped school. They had done this before. The school file shows 40 unauthorized absences for Venables in the preceding year, and 62 for Thompson. On this particular Thursday, however, they did something they had not previously done. They did not go home. They did not go to the local park. They went to a shopping center. The following day, Friday the 12th of February, they skipped school again and returned to the same shopping center. The center was called the Strand Shopping Center. It is in Bootle, a district north of the Liverpool city center. It had approximately 70 shops on 2 levels, 2 large anchor stores, and, critically for our story, a modern closed-circuit television system installed 2 years earlier. The cameras would record on that Friday afternoon what investigators later described as the clearest sequence of images of a child abduction in British criminal history. James Patrick Bulger was born on the 16th of March, 1990. On the 12th of February, 1993, he was 2 years and 10 months old. He was in the Strand Shopping Center with his mother, Denise, and his aunt, Nicola. His mother had stopped at a butcher's shop called A.R. Tim's. She set down a bag for a moment. James let go of her hand. The time on the camera was 3:39 in the afternoon. At 3:42, a camera at the entrance of the shopping center recorded a small boy with blonde hair walking beside a slightly taller boy in a mustard-colored jacket, being led out through the main doors into the winter afternoon. A second boy walked behind them. The camera caught the 3 of them for approximately 22 seconds. Those 22 seconds would become the most reproduced 44-second combined sequence in the history of British journalism. The quality was grainy, the images were black and white, but they were clear enough that 2 days later, when Merseyside police released the footage publicly, a woman in Liverpool recognized the mustard jacket as belonging to a boy in her neighborhood. That boy was John Venables. What happened between the 3:42 camera frame and the discovery of James Bulger's body approximately 2.5 hours later is documented in a police reconstruction that took 10 months to prepare and runs to 460 pages. The 2 boys walked James Bulger for 2.5 miles. They did not take him anywhere in a vehicle. They walked. They crossed a canal. They crossed busy roads. They stopped in several shops. At one point, in a pet store, James was lifted to look at rabbits. The 2 boys were approached by, or passed close to, 38 adults who later came forward to say they had seen the 3 of them. 38 witnesses. Not one of the 38 stopped them. Several asked what they were doing. The replies varied. "He's our little brother. He's lost. We're taking him to the police station. He fell over and bumped his head. We're looking after him." One elderly woman, a Mrs. Irene Hutton, later said in a statement that she nearly telephoned the police but convinced herself she was being silly. Another witness, a man walking his dog near a reservoir, said he saw one of the boys kick the younger child but decided it was a family matter. These statements, all 38 of them, were collected in the months after the arrest, and they form one of the most painful sections of the case file, a section that national broadcasters refused to read aloud during the trial coverage because, in the words of an ITN producer at the time, it would make viewers feel personally accused. The file, however, does read them aloud. Every witness, every moment, every chance that was missed. The body of James Bulger was found on the 14th of February, 1993, Saturday, Valentine's Day, on the railway line near Walton Lane in Liverpool. I will not describe what was done to him. I will tell you only this. The post-mortem report, signed by a pathologist named Dr. Alan Williams, identified 42 separate injuries. Dr. Williams was unable to determine which of several possible injuries had caused death. He spent, according to his own diary entry for that week, 3 hours longer than usual on the examination because, in his words, "I needed to be sure I was not making a mistake." The arrest came 6 days after the killing. Robert Thompson was picked up first, on the 18th of February, after a classmate's mother recognized his face from the CCTV images released on the evening news. John Venables was arrested the same day. Both boys, in their first police interviews, denied everything. Both boys, by the third interview, had begun to blame the other. The interviews were conducted with a parent present and a designated adult. The transcripts were later published in redacted form and became the subject of one of the most important legal decisions of the decade, because the European Court of Human Rights ruled, several years later, that the interview procedures used with two 10-year-olds were unsuitable for children of that age. The boys had been interviewed in adult police interview rooms. The judge at their subsequent trial at Preston Crown Court sat on a raised bench in full robes. The courtroom was, except for the raised platform built so the defendants could see above the dock, a standard adult court. The trial opened on the 1st of November, 1993. The two boys sat side by side. They were the youngest defendants in a murder trial in the United Kingdom in the 20th century. The jury convicted them on the 24th of November. They were sentenced to detention for a minimum of 8 years, a sentence that would be increased to 10, then to 15, then returned to 8 through a series of appeals and public interventions, including a handwritten tariff note by the Home Secretary Michael Howard that was later ruled unlawful by the House of Lords. Both boys were released on parole in June of 2001. They were given new identities protected by a lifelong injunction, the second ever such order in British law, modeled directly on the order that had been created 3 decades earlier for a girl in Newcastle named Mary Bell. Robert Thompson, according to all available information, has remained out of trouble since release. His identity has never been publicly confirmed. John Venables has returned to prison 3 times, in 2010, in 2017, and in 2020, each time for offenses related to possession of severely illegal material involving children. Each time, his identity protection has been challenged. Each time it has been upheld. The 2 boys who walked James Bulger 2.5 miles through Liverpool are now, at the time of this recording, in their early 40s. One of them lives an apparently quiet life. The other is in prison. The 38 witnesses who did not stop them are almost all still alive. Several of them, interviewed anonymously for a BBC documentary in 2013, said the same thing in almost the same words. "We thought it wasn't our business." That sentence, across 38 people, is what the file leaves on the page. Brenda Ann Spencer was born on the 3rd of April 1962 in San Diego, California. I want you to note the date carefully, because the age at which she will commit her act is going to matter later. By the time of the incident, she was 16 years and 9 months old. Some sources call her the first modern American school shooter, and while that phrase is historically debatable, what is not debatable is that she was the first young American to provide, in her own voice, in real time, over the telephone, a reason for what she was doing. And the reason she gave became a song that has now been listened to across streaming platforms and radio broadcasts approximately 1 billion times. Brenda lived with her father, Wallace Spencer, in a house on Lake Atlan Avenue in the San Carlos neighborhood of San Diego. Her mother, Dot Spencer, had left the household some years before. A younger brother, Scott, lived with the mother. Wallace and Brenda lived together in a single-story house that was, according to social workers who later entered it, in a condition that the formal report described as unlivable by any reasonable standard. The house had no working heat. Garbage was piled in the kitchen. Brenda and her father shared a mattress on the living room floor. The social worker's report, written after the arrest, notes this detail without further comment because in 1979, the practice of forensic social work did not yet have a standardized vocabulary for describing what the mattress situation, over a period of several years, implied. The report only says, "The living arrangement is not appropriate for a child of this age." I am going to leave that sentence where the file left it. Brenda had a history of petty crime, shoplifting, vandalism. In 1978, she was arrested for shooting out the windows of the same Cleveland elementary school she would later attack, using a BB rifle. She was assessed by a court-appointed psychiatrist who recommended inpatient mental health treatment. Her father refused to sign the consent form. Instead, he took a different course of action. For Christmas of 1978, Wallace Spencer purchased a semi-automatic .22 caliber rifle. He wrapped it. He placed it under the tree. He gave it to his 16-year-old daughter as a Christmas present. Brenda would later tell a journalist in a 2001 parole board interview, "I asked for a radio. He gave me the rifle. I felt like he wanted me to kill myself." That sentence, "I felt like he wanted me to kill myself," appears in the parole transcript. It was one of the reasons the parole board of that year denied her release. They considered the sentence to be, in the words of one board member, a reframing of responsibility that remains unresolved. On the morning of the 29th of January, 1979, a Monday, Brenda Spencer did not go to school. She opened the living room window of the house on Lake Atlan Avenue. The window faced, directly across the street, Cleveland Elementary School. The school day was beginning. Children were lined up outside the main entrance, waiting for the doors to open. An adult was with them. His name was Burton Ragg. He was the principal of the school. He was 53 years old. Another adult was helping children across the schoolyard. His name was Mike Suchar. He was the head custodian. He was 56 years old. From approximately 8:30 in the morning until just after 8:40, Brenda Spencer used the rifle from her living room window in a way I am not going to describe. Burton Ragg attempted to shield the children and was struck. Mike Suchar attempted to pull him to safety and was also struck. Both men died at the scene. 8 children, aged between 6 and 12, were wounded. A police officer named Robert Robb, who arrived at the scene and attempted to approach the school, was also wounded in the neck. The incident lasted less than 15 minutes. Police surrounded the house. A telephone line was established into the Spencer residence. A journalist from a local radio station, through a mistake in the switchboard transfer that no one has ever fully explained, got through to Brenda directly. He asked her, in a voice that the recording captures as shaking, why she was doing this. And Brenda Spencer, 16 years old, answered with the sentence that would outlive her, outlive the 2 men she had killed, outlive even the school itself, which would later be rebuilt and renamed. She said, "I don't like Mondays. This livens up the day." That was her explanation. The phrase was carried on wire services across the world within hours. In Ireland, a musician named Bob Geldof, who was in the lobby of a radio station in Atlanta, Georgia, saw the story on the telex machine. He wrote a song about it that afternoon. The song was released later that year by his band, the Boomtown Rats. It reached #1 in the United Kingdom and 15 other countries. It has since been recorded, covered, sampled, and streamed approximately 1 billion times. Brenda Spencer has never received any royalties, which is correct, but she has also become, without her consent, one of the most culturally referenced teenage killers in history. Brenda pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder and 1 of assault with a deadly weapon. She was sentenced to 25 years to life. She became eligible for parole in 1993. She has been denied at every parole hearing since. In 2001, in 2005, in 2009, in 2016, and most recently. Each time, the parole board has cited the same 2 factors: her inability to provide a consistent, non-shifting account of her own motivation, and the continuing opposition of the families of Burton Ragg and Mike Sukar. At her 2001 hearing, she said, for the first time, that her father had provided her alcohol and the rifle, and had been abusive toward her in the house they shared. These allegations were investigated and, at the parole board's own request, could not be independently corroborated because Wallace Spencer had died of natural causes in 1993 and no contemporaneous records existed. The board therefore considered the allegations as mitigating but not exonerating. Brenda Spencer is currently incarcerated at the California Institution for Women in Chino. She is in her 60s. The song plays somewhere in the world, on average, approximately every 4 minutes. She is, in that sense, never forgotten and permanently remembered for the wrong sentence in the wrong moment. The file on this one is unusually cold. It ends with a single note by a parole officer in 2016. Subject appears to understand the gravity of what occurred, but is unable to explain it in terms consistent across hearings. Recommendation: denial. That is the entire ending. Before we continue, I want to pause with you for a moment, because the first 3 files, Mary Bell, the Liverpool boys, and Brenda Spencer, are modern cases. They happened within the last 60 years. They have audio, video, documentation, psychological assessments. The next file, the one I am about to open, is 150 years old. It is the oldest file in this entire series. And I want you to understand before I read from it, that what investigators in 1874 wrote down about a 14-year-old boy in Boston is, according to 3 modern forensic psychologists who have reviewed the original documents, the single most unambiguous early medical description of juvenile psychopathy in the English language. They knew what they were looking at. They did not have the vocabulary, but they were not wrong. His name was Jesse Harding Pomeroy. He was born on the 29th of November, 1859, in Charlestown, Massachusetts, a neighborhood of Boston that was, at that time, a working-class area of shipyards, gas lamps, and brick tenements. His father was Thomas Pomeroy, a meatpacker who worked in the slaughterhouses of Charlestown, and who was, according to court records from 1867 and 1869, twice arrested for public intoxication and once for assaulting his wife. His mother was Ruth Ann Pomeroy, who ran a small dress shop on Broadway Street, and who, according to everyone who knew her, was a quiet, hard-working woman who was described by one neighbor in a later interview as a woman who did not smile in public even once in the 20 years I knew her. Jesse was the second of 2 sons. His older brother, Charles, was unremarkable. Jesse was not. Jesse was born with one eye that was clouded white, a congenital defect that gave his face, in the language of the time, a peculiar appearance. He was taunted for it at school. He stopped attending regularly by the age of 10. His father, according to court testimony given later by Jesse's own mother, would beat him publicly in the kitchen, stripped of his clothes with a leather belt, and on at least 2 occasions with a fish skinning knife used flat against the back. Ruth Pomeroy finally separated from her husband when Jesse was 11. She kept the boys, but by then, something had already taken root in the younger son that no one in 1870s Boston had any framework to identify. In the winter of 1871 and 1872, when Jesse Pomeroy was 12 years old, a series of incidents began in the neighborhoods of Chelsea and South Boston. Small boys, aged between 4 and 8, were approached by an older boy. They were led to isolated spots. They were subjected to treatment I am not going to describe. All 7 of the boys survived. All 7 were found by passers-by or returned home on their own. All 7 described the same assailant, a thin boy, perhaps 12 or 13, with one white eye. The Boston police, initially unable to locate the assailant, established a description. In September of 1872, a tram conductor named Robert Hood recognized the description on a boy riding his streetcar. He flagged a patrolman. The boy was Jesse Pomeroy. He was taken to a police station. 6 of the 7 victims identified him in person. Jesse was 12 years and 10 months old. He was sentenced to the House of Reformation at Westboro, a juvenile institution. The sentence was set at minority, meaning until the age of 21. Jesse Pomeroy was released from Westboro on the 6th of February, 1874, after serving less than 18 months of a sentence that was supposed to hold him for nearly 9 years. The reason for his early release, according to the file of the Westboro institution, was exemplary behavior and evident reformation. The superintendent, a man named Gardner Tufts, personally signed the release order. The same superintendent, 18 months later, would testify at a Boston trial that he had been, in his own words, entirely and terribly deceived by the subject. On the 18th of March, 1874, 6 weeks after Jesse Pomeroy's release, a 10-year-old girl named Katie Mary Curran walked into a small dress shop on Broadway Street in South Boston to look at a pair of writing notebooks she had seen in the window. The shop belonged to Ruth Pomeroy. Katie Curran did not come home from school that day. Her parents searched the neighborhood. Her father, Patrick Curran, went to the police that evening. The police, in a decision that an internal review would later describe as one of the most consequential errors in the history of the Boston Police Department, did not search the cellar of the dress shop. They did not search it because, in the words of the investigating officer, it was known that the Pomeroy boy was no longer in the city. That officer had been told this by the boy's mother. She had been mistaken, or she had chosen not to contradict her own son's whereabouts. On the 22nd of April, 1874, 5 weeks after Katie Curran's disappearance, a 4-year-old boy named Horace Millen was found at Dorchester Bay on the marshland of what is now known as Savin Hill. His injuries were severe. The Boston police, looking at what they had found, immediately thought of one person. They went to the Pomeroy dress shop. Jesse Pomeroy was arrested that same afternoon. He had blood on his boots. He confessed in the station within 3 hours. 3 months later, renovations were being done to the Pomeroy dress shop in preparation for sale. Ruth Pomeroy had been forced to close the business after her son's arrest. A workman digging in the cellar found the remains of Katie Curran. Her case, unsolved for 3 months, was solved inside of a morning. Ruth Pomeroy was charged briefly as an accessory, but the charge was dropped. She maintained for the rest of her life that she had never known her son was using the cellar. Whether that is true, the file does not decide. I will not decide it either. What I can tell you is that Jesse Pomeroy was convicted of the killing of Horace Millen at a trial at Suffolk Superior Court in December of 1874. He was 14 years old. The jury returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. The sentence, under Massachusetts law of that time, was death by hanging. Jesse Pomeroy would have been the youngest person sentenced to death in Massachusetts history. The sentence was pronounced, and then Massachusetts and the nation entered a debate that lasted nearly 2 years. Governors reviewed the sentence, petitions were filed. The argument was not whether Jesse Pomeroy had committed the act. He had. The argument was whether a legal system could, with any coherence, execute a child for an act that, even the prosecution admitted, the child did not seem to understand the moral weight of. The governor at the time, Alexander H. Rice, signed a commutation in 1876. The death sentence was converted to imprisonment for life in solitary confinement. Not imprisonment in solitary, for life. Jesse Pomeroy was transferred to the Charlestown State Prison. He was placed in a single cell. He was given meals through a slot. He was allowed 1 hour per day of exercise in a small yard, alone. He was not to speak to other inmates. He was not to be addressed by them. This continued, with very few variations, for 41 years. 41 years, reader. 4 decades of a human being in a room alone. In 1917, after petitions from prison reformers, Jesse Pomeroy was moved out of pure solitary confinement into a slightly less restrictive regime. In 1929, he was transferred to Bridgewater State Hospital, where he died on the 29th of September of that year. He was 69 years old. He had spent 55 of those 69 years in a closed institution. He had spent, by the prison's own count, more than 40 of those years entirely alone. During those 4 decades, he escaped once, in 1890, spending several hours outside his cell after removing a granite block from the wall by himself, a feat that prison engineers later described as physically almost impossible. He was recaptured inside the prison. He read voraciously. He learned 6 languages. He filed more legal petitions than any inmate in Massachusetts history up to that time, a total, according to the state archives, of over 400. In every petition, he insisted that solitary confinement had cured him of whatever had been wrong with him as a boy. In none of them did he express any statement of regret for Horace Millen or Katie Curran. The file closes with a sentence from the Bridgewater Hospital chaplain's log for the day Jesse Pomeroy died. The sentence reads, "He asked for nothing, and he said nothing." That is the entire ending. I want you to understand something about the transition we are about to make. The first 4 files in this episode, Mary Bell, the Liverpool boys, Brenda Spencer, and Jesse Pomeroy, involve children acting on instincts that even trained forensic psychiatrists struggle to identify a trigger for. The next file is different. The next file has a clear, traceable, painfully ordinary trigger. It is the file that most resembles lives that many viewers will recognize, not because they have lived them, but because they have seen them at school, in their own neighborhood, at the edge of their own childhood. The name in the next file is Eric Michael Smith. He was 13 years old. He was bullied. And what happened next is the sentence that changed the way American juvenile courts look at childhood bullying forever. Eric Smith was born on the 22nd of January, 1980, in the town of Savona in upstate New York, a small, rural community in the Finger Lakes region, population under 1,000, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and where, critically for our story, everyone knew what you looked like. Because Eric Smith, from birth, looked like a specific kind of child that other children in a rural American town in the 1980s had been given very clear social permission to attack. He had bright orange-red hair. He had the medication whose brand name appears in the case file, but which, for privacy reasons attached to his ongoing health care, I am not going to read aloud. The condition gave his ears a slightly protruding appearance and affected the alignment of his jaw. He was, in short, a child whose face was different. And from the age of 4, according to interviews later conducted with his mother, Tammy Smith, and his teachers, Eric Smith was bullied for it, daily, relentlessly. By older children, and by children his own age. The school file from Bradford Central School, where Eric was enrolled from kindergarten through the 7th grade, contains 22 separate written notes. 22, over a period of 7 years, from teachers to administrators, about bullying directed at Eric Smith. Words recorded in the file include carrot top, freak face, alien ears, and 4 eyes. On 3 separate occasions, physical altercations. Once, a group of 6th graders tied him to a chain-link fence at recess with his own jacket. Once, a boy urinated on Eric's backpack. Once, his thick glasses, which his family had saved for 3 months to afford, were broken by a boy throwing a rock at them. The school, according to the same file, documented all of this. The school did nothing about any of it. That is not a rhetorical statement. The file contains no record of a single disciplinary action taken against any other child for bullying Eric Smith over the entire 7-year period. Eric's home life was not severely abusive. His parents were not wealthy, but they were present. His mother worked at a supermarket. His stepfather, Theodore Smith, worked at a local factory. His biological father was not in the picture. He had younger siblings. The family lived in a modest trailer. There were, according to social workers who later interviewed the family, signs of domestic tension, raised voices, occasional drinking by the stepfather, but no documented physical abuse. Eric was not beaten at home. Eric was not starved at home. Eric was loved at home, in the ordinary, complicated way that American working-class families love. The problem was not at home. The problem was the door he walked out of every morning, and the building he walked into at 8:15 and did not walk out of again until 3:20 in the afternoon. On the morning of the 2nd of August, 1993, a Monday, Eric Smith was 13 years and 6 months old. It was the summer between his 7th and 8th grade years. He was attending a summer day camp program, a free community program run by the local recreation department. He left his house that morning on his bicycle. It was approximately 9 in the morning. The camp was a short ride away. On the same morning, at approximately the same time, a 4-year-old boy named Derek Roby left his own home, 3 blocks away from where Eric had just started his ride. Derek's mother, Doreen Roby, had given her son permission to walk to the camp by himself. It was the first time she had ever let him walk alone. The walk was 3 blocks. It was through a small rural town. It was broad daylight. Doreen Roby watched her son walk to the end of the street and turn the corner. That is the last time she saw him alive. What happened between that corner and the wooded lot where Derek Roby was found approximately 4 hours later is, in the file, described in Eric Smith's own words, as he gave them to 2 investigators from the Steuben County Sheriff's Department on the 6th of August, 1993, 4 days later, after his mother, Tammy Smith, recognized something in her son's behavior that she could not ignore. She brought him to the police station herself. Eric Smith confessed within the first hour of his interview. He did not resist, he did not deny. He told the detectives what he had done in a flat, quiet, unemotional voice that, according to the interviewing detective, a man named Charles Chilbowski, was the most disturbing feature of the entire interview. Detective Chilbowski would later tell a reporter, "He described what he had done the way you would describe what you had for lunch." That sentence is in the Steuben County file. What Eric Smith described was this. He had followed Derek Roby on his bicycle. He had pulled up next to him. He had offered to show the younger boy a shortcut to the camp. Derek had followed him. Eric had led him to a wooded lot off the main road. And in that lot, Eric Smith had done things to a 4-year-old that I am not going to repeat to you. The file records them. I have read them. I will not read them to you. What I will tell you is what Eric Smith said when Detective Chilbowski, at the end of the first interview, asked him the only question that mattered. Why? Why had he done this? And Eric Smith, 13 years old, bullied every day of his life, said the following sentence. "I was angry. I wanted someone to be scared of me instead of me being scared of them. And I picked him because he was smaller than me. Because no one is ever angry at someone smaller than them." That sentence is the most chilling sentence in the Eric Smith case, and it is the sentence that would be cited repeatedly for the next 30 years in American juvenile justice debates about what bullying, unaddressed, can do to a child who is already fragile. Not as an excuse, not as a justification, but as an explanation. The thing that children who are bullied every day learn, the researchers would later argue, is not how to become nonviolent. It is how to identify someone weaker than them, because a victim needs a victim in order to stop being one. Eric Smith had not wanted to kill a 4-year-old. Eric Smith had wanted, for one time in his life, to be the scary one instead of the scared one. And Derek Roby, small, trusting, willing to follow a bigger boy who said he knew a shortcut, was the first person in Eric's life who was not bigger, stronger, or more powerful than he was. Eric Smith was tried as a juvenile in New York State in 1994. he was convicted of murder in the second degree. Under the juvenile offender statute, he was sentenced to 9 years to life in prison, the maximum sentence available for a 13-year-old under New York law at that time. He entered the system at the Harlem Valley Secure Center, a juvenile facility. At 18, he was transferred into the adult prison system. He served his time across 7 different facilities. He became eligible for parole in 2002. He was denied. He was denied in 2004. He was denied in 2006, in 2008, in 2010, in 2012, in 2014, in 2016, in 2018, and in 2020. 10 parole denials. On each application, Eric Smith did the same thing. He wrote a personal letter to Doreen and Dale Roby, the parents of Derek. In each letter, he apologized. He did not ask for forgiveness. He said he did not expect it. He said he knew there was nothing he could say that would restore what he had taken. He said, in one of the letters, a letter that the Roby family eventually, after many years, agreed to make public. I was 13. I did not understand what I did. I am 40. I do not understand it any better. I only understand that I did it. And I only ask, if you can, to believe that the person I am now is not the person I was then. The Roby family, in 10 consecutive parole hearings, stood up and asked the board to deny parole. They were clear. They were calm. They were not angry, not in the way you would expect. They were, in the words of a journalist who covered several of the hearings, exhausted in a way that no family should ever be exhausted. In 2022, on the 11th application, the parole board voted to grant parole to Eric Smith. He was 42 years old. He had served 28 years. He was released under lifetime supervision with restrictions on his contact with children, on his location, and on his employment. He now lives, according to public sources, in a rural area of upstate New York under his real name. He has not spoken to the press. The Roby family, after the parole was granted, issued a single statement. It said, "We disagree with the decision. We are tired. We hope Derek would have wanted us to stop." That statement is the ending of the Eric Smith file. It is the only ending on this list that contains, from the family of the victim, a sentence with the word hope in it. I want you to hold that detail, because the next file, and the final file in this episode, contains no such sentence at all. I want to tell you now about 2 girls. I want to tell you about them in the order the court told them. Pauline Yvonne Parker. Juliet Marion Home. Pauline was born on the 26th of May, 1938, in Christchurch, New Zealand. Juliet was born on the 28th of October, 1938, in Greenwich, London. Pauline grew up in a 2-bedroom house in a working-class part of Christchurch. Her father, Herbert Reaper, was a fish shop manager. Her mother, Honora Mary Parker, though she used the name Honora Reaper, was a homemaker who ran a small boarding house. Pauline had 2 older sisters and a younger brother. She had contracted osteomyelitis, a serious bone infection, as a small child, and had spent long periods in the hospital. Her leg would bear the scars of the infection for the rest of her life. She walked at times with a slight limp. She was intelligent, bookish, introverted, and, according to a school report from Christchurch Girls High School in 1951, a student of exceptional verbal ability held back by a marked tendency toward solitude. Juliet Hume was the daughter of Dr. Henry Rainsford Hume, a Cambridge-educated physicist who had become the rector of Canterbury University College in Christchurch, and of Hilda Marion Hume, a marriage guidance counselor. The Hume family had moved from England to New Zealand in 1948 for Dr. Hume's post. Juliet, like Pauline, had been seriously ill as a child, tuberculosis, for which she had been sent to sanatoriums in the Bahamas and South Africa for long periods of recuperation. She had been separated from her family for years at a time. She was intelligent, theatrical, confident, and, according to a school report from Christchurch Girls High School in 1952, a student of vivid imagination who dominates conversations with adults as easily as with peers. The two girls met at Christchurch Girls' High School in 1952. Pauline was 13. Juliet was 14. They recognized something in each other almost immediately. Both had been long-term hospital patients as small children. Both had spent critical developmental years in isolation. Both felt that the ordinary life of a New Zealand schoolgirl was a kind of cage they had entered too late and did not quite know how to live inside. Within weeks, they were inseparable. They walked to and from school together. They wrote to each other during class. They spent weekends at each other's houses. Over the next 2 years, between 1952 and 1954, the two girls constructed a shared imaginary world. They called it Barovnia. It had its own monarchy, its own geography, its own religion, its own characters, its own ongoing political intrigues. The girls wrote novels set in Barovnia. They wrote poetry. They sculpted small clay figures of the Barovnian royal family. They spoke, when alone together, in Barovnian accents, a deliberately formal, slightly archaic English meant to suggest aristocratic European speech. They kept diaries. Pauline Parker, in particular, kept a detailed, near-daily diary from 1953 through 1954. That diary, later seized by police, became the central piece of evidence in what would become the most famous criminal case in New Zealand history. Because the diary was not only a record of Barovnia, the diary was a record of the friendship itself. And the diary was a record of what the two girls began to think, starting in late 1953, when the adults in their lives began to try to separate them. In April of 1954, Dr. Holmes' marriage was collapsing. His wife Hilda had begun an affair with a lodger in the Holmes household. Dr. Holmes had accepted a position that would take him back to England and then to a position in the United Kingdom Atomic Weapons Program. He intended to take Juliet with him, partly for her health, partly to remove her from what he perceived as the damaging intensity of her friendship with Pauline. Pauline, meanwhile, was considered by her own parents to be spending too much time away from the family, too much time in the Holmes household, too much time, in short, with Juliet. The mothers of both girls had begun to discuss the situation. A doctor had been consulted. The doctor, in a consultation note that would later be entered into evidence, had used a word for the relationship between the two girls that was, in the vocabulary of the early 1950s, a deeply stigmatizing word, and which suggested that the relationship was not merely intense, but, in the opinion of the examining physician, pathological. The two girls read, or were told about, this consultation. They understood, at that point, what was coming. Juliet was going to be taken to England. Pauline was going to be left behind. The plan, initially, was for Pauline to accompany the Hume family to England. Pauline's mother, Honora, refused to permit this. Honora Reaper refused to sign the travel documents that would have allowed her 15-year-old daughter to leave the country with another family. That refusal, that single refusal, by a woman who was, in every account, a devoted, attentive, entirely ordinary mother who loved her daughter very much, was what Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume decided in the late winter and early spring of 1954 to correct. The word Pauline used in her diary, in multiple entries over the course of several months, was moider. It was a deliberate misspelling. The entries described, with increasing specificity, a plan to remove Honora from the situation so that the two girls could not be parted. The diary is, and remains, one of the most chilling documents in criminal history, precisely because it is not the diary of a person losing control. It is the diary of two intelligent, literate, imaginative teenage girls making a calm, deliberate, long-term decision, and returning to that decision again and again over months, and never once, in the pages that survive, expressing any doubt about it. On the 22nd of June, 1954, a Tuesday, Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume invited Honora Reaper for a walk in Victoria Park, a wooded park on the Port Hills overlooking Christchurch. Pauline had suggested the walk. Honora, wanting to be part of her daughter's world, agreed. The three of them took the bus to the park. They had lunch at a small tea kiosk. They began to walk down a wooded path. Pauline had placed, in her handbag, a single object. It was half of a brick. The brick had been wrapped carefully in a stocking. The stocking served two functions. It kept the brick secure in her hand. It also meant the brick itself would not leave a direct print on anything it struck. This was not an impulsive object. It had been prepared days in advance. On the wooded path, in a place chosen for its distance from the tea kiosk and from any other walkers, the two girls did to honor a reaper what they had planned in Pauline's diary to do. The attack involved approximately 45 separate blows, according to the medical examiner. It did not take long. Honora Reaper was 54 years old. The two girls then ran back down the path to the tea kiosk. They were hysterical, visibly, audibly, convincingly hysterical. They told the kiosk attendant, a woman named Agnes Ritchie, that Honora had fallen and hit her head on a plank. Mrs. Ritchie looked at the two girls, at Pauline, covered in blood, at Juliet, slightly less so, and understood immediately that whatever had happened in the woods was not a fall. She called the police. The investigation lasted less than a day. The two girls were separated. The diary was found in Pauline's bedroom that evening, in a drawer, not even hidden. The entries in the diary were read by a detective named Archie Tate. Detective Tate would later say, in an interview given many years after his retirement, "I have read evidence in many cases. That diary was the worst thing I have ever read, because it was so calm." The trial opened on the 23rd of August, 1954, at the Christchurch Supreme Court. It lasted 6 days. The prosecution entered the diary into evidence. The defense attempted to argue that the two girls had been in the grip of a shared delusional disorder, a folie à deux, and that they were not criminally responsible. The jury did not accept that argument. Both girls were convicted of murder on the 29th of August, 1954. Because they were both under the age of 18, they could not be sentenced to death under New Zealand law of that time. They were sentenced to be detained at the pleasure of Her Majesty. An indefinite sentence. They were separated immediately and told they would never see each other again. Pauline was sent to Mount Eden Prison. Juliet was sent to Arohata. The condition of their release, it was understood by both of them and by the authorities, was that they would not, under any circumstances, attempt to resume contact. They were, each of them, 15 years old at the time of the conviction. They each served approximately 5 years. Juliet Home was released in November of 1959. Pauline Parker was released in November of 1959 as well. Both girls, on release, were given new identities. Both left New Zealand. Both went to England. They did not see each other again. And now we come to the part of the Parker Home file that makes it different from every other file in this episode. Because Juliet Home, released at the age of 20, given a new name, required to never speak of the past, did what no other child in this entire list of 6 did. She became famous again. Under her new name, Anne Perry, she chose the name from a stepfather she had acquired after her parents' divorce, and she chose Perry for reasons she never fully explained. Juliet Hume rebuilt a life. She worked variously as a flight attendant, as an insurance underwriter, as an assistant in a chandelier shop. She lived in California. She lived in England. She lived in Scotland. She joined the Mormon Church in 1968. She began, in her mid-30s, to write. Her first published novel appeared in 1979. It was a Victorian-era mystery called The Cater Street Hangman. It was a success. She wrote another. It was a success. She wrote another. By the end of her life, she died on the 10th of April, 2023, at the age of 84. Anne Perry had published more than 100 novels. She had sold, by conservative estimates, more than 26 million copies of her books worldwide. The vast majority of those books were mysteries. The vast majority of those mysteries were about murders. And for nearly 40 years, the readers of those books, millions of them, did not know that the woman writing them had, at the age of 15, in a wooded park in Christchurch, New Zealand, participated in a real-life killing of her best friend's mother. That was exposed in 1994. a New Zealand film director named Peter Jackson made a film about the Parker Hume case titled Heavenly Creatures. The film was acclaimed. It was nominated for an Academy Award for its screenplay. And during the publicity for the film, a New Zealand journalist tracing the post-release lives of Pauline Parker and Juliet Hume identified Juliet Hume as the crime novelist Anne Perry. The story broke internationally. Anne Perry, confirmed it. She gave several interviews. She said she regretted what she had done. She said she had been, at the time, under the influence of an illness she could not name. She said she had been a foolish, arrogant, dramatic teenage girl who had believed her own imagination more than she believed the world. She continued to write. Her readers, by and large, continued to read her. Pauline Parker, on the other hand, moved to a small village in the English county of Kent. She took a new name, Hilary Nathan. She ran for many years a children's writing school. She never spoke publicly. Journalists occasionally located her. She refused every interview. She is, at the time of this recording, still alive. She is in her mid-80s. She lives quietly. She has not, as far as anyone has ever been able to confirm, seen Juliet Hume again since 1954. The two girls who shared, for 2 years, an imaginary kingdom called Barovnia have spent the last 70 years doing the only thing the court ordered them to do. They have remained apart. And one of them has made millions of readers spend their evenings reading, in the plot of novel after novel about imaginary murders, without those readers ever knowing that the writer in question was an expert on what the inside of a real one feels like. 6 children, 6 files, 6 handwritings. I have read from all of them now. And before we close this episode, I want to tell you something that, in 31 years of working with these kinds of documents, I have only recently been able to articulate. It is not about the children. It is about the files themselves. Because the files are, every single one of them, full of adults. The files are full of teachers who wrote not San Diego, who put a rifle under a Christmas tree. The files are full of a superintendent at a reformatory in Massachusetts who signed an early release form for a boy because, as he wrote in his own hand, I judged him reformed. The files are full of school teachers in a small town in upstate New York who documented 7 years of bullying and took 0 disciplinary actions. The files are full of a doctor in Christchurch who used a pathologizing word about 2 teenage girls and 2 mothers who, reading that word, took the wrong lesson from it. I am not here to tell you that the adults are the reason. I am not here to remove responsibility from any of these 6 children. Every one of them knew. Every one of them understood. Every one of them, at the moment they did what they did, was capable of choosing otherwise. I am not going to give you the comfortable adult explanation that too young to know better is always a lie. But I am going to give you the equally uncomfortable adult sentence that, in all 6 of these cases, the adults around the child could see something. Every single time. Every single case. And in every single case, an adult did less than they could have done. That is the sentence the world refuses to read out loud. That is the sentence that is buried on the last page of every file. Not in children's handwriting, in adult handwriting, in notes signed by teachers, in assessments signed by psychiatrists, in witness statements given by people walking their dogs, in release papers signed by superintendents, in unsigned consent forms, in 22 filed bullying complaints and 0 follow-ups, in the quiet, careful cursive of people who, looking at a child, told themselves they did not need to do anything yet. Next week, on this channel, I'm going to open that second set of files. I am going to read you what we know about the parents of the children you have heard about tonight. I am going to read you what social workers wrote about Betty Bell. I am going to read you what neighbors said about the Venables household and what the family court said about Anne Thompson. I am going to read you what investigators found inside the house on Lake Atlan Avenue after Brenda Spencer was taken out of it. I am going to read you the school discipline files of Bradford Central School, the ones that documented Eric Smith's bullying and filed the documents and did nothing else. I am going to read you Dr. Hume's letters to his wife in the weeks before June of 1954, letters that have only recently been released by the family archive. And I am going to tell you, file by file, what the adults in these stories were doing while the children in these stories were becoming who they became. Because if this episode has a single sentence at its center, it is this: the evil of a child is always, in the end, a file opened inside a house. And the first pages of that file are never written by the child. 6 children, 6 files, 6 handwritings. And the sentence the world refuses to read out loud is the one we are going to read next. My name is Blackwell. You have been very patient. You have been very brave. And I will see you again very soon with the files of the parents. Thank you for staying until the end. Do not tell yourself when you close this tab that the story is over. It is not over. It has not even started. The next file is already open on my desk. Good night.